Good morning. This is week 2 of Social Work 506. The focus this week is on cognitive, behavioral, and brief treatment methods. So in the week 2 module, please first look at the overview video, and then our learning objectives are as follows. After completing the activities this week, you will be able to identify the differences between cognitive and behavioral theories. Explain how those theories work together in cognitive behavioral treatment intervention, CBT, and identify skills needed to implement CBT. The learning activities for this week are as follows, starting with our learning resources. There are 2 chapters in the Walsh book this week. One is Chapter 7 on behavior theory and Chapter 8 on cognitive theory, and an additional reading on the experiences of staff taking on the role of lay therapists in a group-based cognitive behavioral therapy anger management intervention for people with intellectual disabilities. There are 2 videos this week, both by Beck, who is instrumental in the development of cognitive therapy. So look at both those videos by Beck, who explains the usages of cognitive behavioral therapy. So they are short videos. And then we have 2 discussion posts for this week. First is the dyad collaboration. So all of you were informed of who your dyad partner is. And again, there's one person who for this assignment will be working alone. So you are to do the following. Find a video of a social worker using cognitive and or behavioral interventions with a client, similar to the first of the videos listed in this week's series of videos. And then together post a link to that video, and then write a critique outlining the skills you observed and how the therapist is using theory to guide the intervention. Only one member needs to post, but both should work together. And then you are to respond to at least one other dyad's video posting, and this is each member of the dyad is to do that response. And as always, this is due Thursday with a follow-up response between Friday and Saturday. The next discussion post is around identifying your population of choice and theory. And this has to do with the first major paper assignment, which is due in week 3. So in this forum, you are to do the following. Complete and describe the population that you are selecting for your major assignment. And this is for both your social work practice theory paper and social work practice intervention paper. And then briefly describe a theory that guides practice with this population and what research says to support why and how that theory applies to the population. So not all theories have been studied well enough to know how they work on all populations. So this requires you to do some research. This exercise is meant to get you started towards your social work practice theory paper, which we'll look at in a second, which is due in week 3. And then you will respond to one of your classmates' posts. So let's see if quickly this will come up in terms of the social work practice theory paper. So this assignment is due week 3. Refer to the syllabus for additional guidelines, but in terms of an overview, this paper provides you with an opportunity to review the practice theory and research literature on 2 theoretical approaches. For example, structural family theory, cognitive theory, behavior theory, the 2 of which you're studying this week, with a specific problem population. Consider doing this paper on the same problem population as your case presentation due week 6 so that you can explore clinical work with that client population more thoroughly. Imagine you are a clinical social worker with that client. Pick 2 theories to research and describe why they apply to and are useful in conceptualizing the client population. So the components are as follows. It should be 3 to 5 pages in length, double-spaced, 12-point font. Include a title page as always and reference page with complete APA formatted citations for the literature you have reviewed. This does not include your title page or reference page. The text of the paper should be organized in a narrative with the following section headings. Introduction, what you will cover in this area. 2, the problem population. Briefly describe the problem population you will be addressing, including the problem population discussion. In the problem population discussion, provide the characteristics or challenges facing this population. Specifically, use 1 or 2 references to support this discussion. Review and critique of 2 theories, and you need to look at each theory. So for each theory, identify the theoretical framework and underlying assumptions, discuss the empirical basis or lack of empirical basis for the theory, conclusions and references, and the requirement is at least a minimum of 5 scholarly references. This is not internet references unless they are out online scholarly articles you have downloaded. So please make note of that. So those are the 2 assignments for this week. To talk briefly about behavioral and cognitive theory, let's quickly go through the following. So with behavior theory, and you'll note that often people talk about CBT and cognitive behavioral theory as though it is one theory. So this PowerPoint discusses behavior theory, cognitive theory, and then often the 2 are combined together so that in cognitive theory, we're changing thinking. Behavior theory, we would be changing behavior. So behavior theory consists of ideas about how human actions and emotions develop, are sustained, and eliminated through principles of learning. Practitioners are distinguished by their relative lack of concern with the client's internal mental processes, which again puts this into the brief treatment category versus psychodynamic theory. And the focus is on what we can observe, the physical, observable, or objective behavior. So by definition, it seeks to explain human behavior by analyzing what comes before and the consequences that are present in the individual's environment and the learned associations he or she has acquired through previous experiences. There are 3 major approaches. Behavior analysis focused on consequences of the behavior. Stimulus response model focused on environmental factors that elicit and maintain a behavior. And social learning theory, which adds a concern with cognitive mediational processes. Some of the early theorists you'll read about in the readings are Wilhelm Wundt, who believed that laws of cognitive and emotional experience should be derived with the same research methods that were used to study human physiology. Pavlov, I'm sure all of you have heard of, who is associated with classical conditioning. Thorndike invented a puzzle box for experiments with rats and developed the first principles of operant conditioning. Watson coined the phrase behaviorism, B.F. Skinner looked at how environmental factors impact behaviors, and Thomas was listed as the first social worker to advocate the application of a behavioral perspective to direct practice. Major concepts. Behavior is what a person does, thinks, or feels that can be observed. We infer about mental activity, which should be inference about mental activity should be minimized as it cannot be observed. People are motivated to seek pleasure and avoid pain and are likely to behave in ways to avoid pain, even if the way they behave is negative. People behave based on learning, direct environmental feedback, and by watching others. Behavior can be changed, but it has to first be defined, and that change has to be defined. Intervention focuses on reinforcements or punishments for behavior. Thoughts and feelings are behavior subject to reinforcement principles, and the simplest explanation for behaviors are the best. 3 components: classical conditioning, which is a process of developing patterns of behavior through responses to environmental stimuli or specific behavioral consequences. We have operant conditioning, which says that future behavior is determined by the consequences of present behavior. And then there is modeling. Behaviors are learned by watching others engage in behaviors and can be reinforced or punished for them. Assessment. A functional behavior analysis is when the client's problem behavior is specified as clearly and concretely as possible. Environmental conditions that enhance or maintain the behavior are identified. Consequences are considered, and questions are asked about cues that may occur in the environment, social, physical, cognitive, or emotional domains. In terms of our intervention, clients' problems are stated in behavioral terms. Measurable outcomes related to problem reduction are developed. The practitioner and client work together to gather baseline data on the problem behavior. Steps required to reach resolution are specified. The client's personal and environmental resources for making changes are also specified. Steps continued in intervention. Possible obstacles to goal achievement are identified in advance and plans are made to minimize them. An appropriate intervention strategy is chosen with the participation of the client, with emphasis on positive consequences for new behavior. Data is collected and behavioral changes are regularly documented. Intervention is evaluating through looking at the baseline data and comparing it with the current behavior, and intervention is terminated after the goals are achieved, and it is likely that goal achievement will be maintained. Some criticism of the theory is that it does not adequately attend to the broad biopsychosocial spiritual perspective on human behavior. Interventions rely on a controlled environment where reinforcements must be consistently applied, and it's difficult to isolate the significant antecedents and reinforcements that surround many problem behaviors. And these next 2 slides are just the references for this part of the PowerPoint. And so then we go to cognitive theory. And cognitive theory says that we develop habits of thinking that form the basis for our screening and coding of environmental input, categorizing and evaluating that experience, and making judgments on how to behave. Also says that thoughts occur prior to emotions and in fact produce them. Beck, who is a major theorist in cognitive theory, outlines the relationship between thoughts, feelings, and behaviors as an activating event that produces a belief or thought, which produces an emotion or action. Interventions are focused on enhancing the rationality of a client's thinking patterns, the degree to which conclusions about the self and the world are based on external evidence, and the linear connections among a person's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Some of these early theorists include, there were many listed, but Albert Ellis is considered the first cognitive therapist, believed that people can consciously adopt principles of reasoning and view the client's underlying assumptions about himself, herself, and the world as targets of intervention. Help people become more reasonable about how they approach problems. And then there's Beck. Cognitive schemas are made up of personal ineffectiveness, personal degradation, and the world as an essentially unpleasant place, which results in negativism of the cognitive processes. So then the therapy is how do you reverse these? Major concepts. I just mentioned a schema or our internalized representation of the world or patterns of thought, action, and problem solving. Schemas include the ways that we organize thought processes, store information, process new information, and integrate the products of those operations. It's a motor theory, which means that we do not merely receive and process external stimuli, but are active in constructing the reality we seek to apprehend. Rational thinking is based on external evidence, life-preserving, keeps one directed towards personal goals, and decreases internal conflict. And it's used for persons over 12 because the person must be able to engage in abstract thought, which then will limit its use to certain population and exclude other populations, those who are actively psychotic, those with developmental, serious developmental delays. So there are populations that cognitive therapy will not work. Assessment. The rationality of a client's thinking is assessed through Socratic questioning. So this means through examining the validity of a client's assumptions associated with a problem through detailed, focused questioning. The client describes the presenting problem and some of its history, and the assessment ends with the social worker helping the client to arrive at a tentative conclusion about the rationality of thought patterns and or examining willingness to considering alternatives to the distortions. Intervention. Cognitive restructuring is a technique, so it's used when the client's thinking patterns are distorted and contribute to problem development and persistence. The worker helps the client experiment with alternative ways of approaching challenges that will promote goal attainment. The ABC model, A is the activating event, B is the client's belief about or interpretation of the event, C is the emotional and behavioral consequences of B. Behavior change requires 3 steps. First, the person is helped to identify the thoughts preceding and accompanying the distressing emotion or non-productive action. Second is to assess the client's willingness to consider alternative thoughts in response to the problem situation. And third is to challenge the client's irrational beliefs by designing natural experiments, tasks that can be carried out daily. Intervention continued. Cognitive coping. The practitioner helps the client learn and practice newer, more effective ways of dealing with stress and negative moods. Involves education and skills development that targets both covert and overt cognitive operations with the goal of helping clients become more effective at managing their challenges. Self-instruction skills development based on the idea of giving oneself a pep talk. So the worker and client walk through the problem situation, rehearse implementation, and move from overt to covert self-talk. And then communication skills development. Components include using I messages, reflective and empathic listening, and making clear behavior change requests. Problem-solving skills development. There's a structured 5-step method. First step is defining the problem. Second is the client and worker brainstorm to generate as many possible solutions as possible. Evaluate the alternatives and kick out those that are not viable. Choose and implement an alternative. Choosing and implementing an alternative involves selecting a strategy for problem resolution that appears to maximize benefits over costs, and then evaluate the implemented option. Lastly, criticisms of the theory include this idea the thought is prior to most emotional experience. The idea that emotions influence thought is antithetical to the principle stressed in this theory. Emphasis is on conscious rather than unconscious thought, so ignoring the fact that unconscious thought may lead to never understanding the root cause of a person's thoughts. Ignoring unconscious thought may lead to never understanding the root cause of a person's thoughts and emotions. Cognitive theory has an individual rather than relational focus. Cognitive theory overemphasizes objectivity and rationality. And the last one was cognitive theory employs overly structured approaches. So those are the 2 theories for this week. I will also attach this PowerPoint to the announcement. If you have any questions, please contact me as quickly as possible, and I look forward to reading your posts for this week.